We don't serve people like you here." The sentence didn't just land, it sliced clean through the low hum of conversation, through the clink of silverware against porcelain, through the soft jazz drifting from the speakers overhead. And for a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to pause, as if the walls themselves were listening to what had just been said, and every head turned not toward the speaker first, but toward the man it was aimed at. The man sitting calmly at a corner table near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, where the city lights stretched for miles like a quiet declaration of power. Marcus Ellington didn't flinch, not a blink, not a shift in posture. He simply sat there in a plain charcoal t-shirt and dark jeans, hands resting lightly on the table as if he had all the time in the world, while Tyler Grant, the waiter, stood across from him with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes, holding a menu he had no intention of placing down, his voice louder than necessary, confident in the kind of authority that only exists when it's borrowed. "Sir, I'm going to need you to move. This section is reserved for paying guests," he added, doubling down now that the room had given him an audience. A few patrons exchanged glances. A couple near the bar leaned closer to hear better. Someone softly chuckled, not out of humor, but discomfort, the kind that comes when something feels wrong but no one has decided to say it yet. Marcus slowly lifted his eyes to meet Tyler's, steady, unreadable. And for a split second, something in that gaze made Tyler hesitate. But pride is louder than instinct, and he pressed forward. "You can try the place down the street. They're more flexible." The implication hung in the air heavier than the words themselves. And still Marcus didn't react the way Tyler expected. No raised voice, no argument, no attempt to defend himself. Instead, he reached for the water glass already on the table, took a slow sip, and set it back down with deliberate care, the ice settling with a soft crack that somehow sounded louder than the insult that came before it. Around them, the restaurant resumed its motion, but quieter now, more aware, as if everyone understood they were watching something unfold in real time. Tyler shifted his weight, irritated now by the lack of resistance. "Did you hear me?" he said, sharper this time. "We're going to need to leave." But Marcus simply leaned back slightly in his chair, his presence calm, anchored like someone who belonged exactly where he was more than anyone else in the room. And that calm began to do something strange to the space. It unsettled it. A woman at a nearby table glanced at her partner and whispered something under her breath, a man in a suit near. The bar stopped mid-sip, watching, calculating, while in the background a young busboy named Jamal Reed froze for just a second, tray in hand, his eyes flicking between Tyler and Marcus, something about the name on the reservation screen earlier echoing in his mind. Something he couldn't quite place yet, but felt important. Tyler noticed the hesitation in the room and mistook it for support, straightening his posture, raising his voice just enough to reclaim control. "We have standards here," he said, each word carefully chosen to sound like policy instead of prejudice, "and you're not meeting them." That was the moment the air changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because Marcus finally spoke, his voice low, measured, cutting through the noise without needing to rise above it. "Standards," he repeated, almost as if testing the word. Then he looked around the room slowly, taking in every face, every witness, before returning his gaze to Tyler. "That's interesting," he said, and there was something in his tone now, something subtle but undeniable, not anger, not even annoyance, but certainty, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself. And for the first time, Tyler's confidence flickered, just for a second, before he forced a tight smile back onto his face, unaware that in the next few minutes, everything he thought he understood about power, about status, about who belonged and who didn't, was about to collapse right there in the middle of the dining room. Tyler let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, shaking his head as if he had already made up his mind about how this would end. "Yeah, standards," he repeated, leaning slightly closer to the table, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled, but loud enough for nearby tables to still hear. "And right now you are not meeting them." But Marcus did not move, not even a shift of his shoulders. He simply sat there as if the chair beneath him was not just a seat, but a statement. Something rooted, something intentional, his eyes drifting briefly past Tyler toward the rest of the dining room, taking in the subtle shifts in posture, the quiet attention building like pressure in a sealed room. A woman in a navy dress near the window leaned back slightly. Her fork paused mid-air. A man in a gray blazer checked his watch, but did not look away. And at the service station, Jamal still stood frozen for half a second too long before catching himself and continuing to wipe down a glass that was already clean, his mind replaying the reservation list from earlier that evening. The name that had stood out not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was unmistakable: Marcus Ellington, Party of One, flagged with a note he had never seen before. Executive override. He swallowed, unsure if he should speak, unsure if he should stay silent, because in places like this silence often felt safer than truth. Tyler straightened again, regaining his rhythm. "Look, I'm trying to help you out," he said, the words coated in something that sounded like politeness but carried none of its weight. "You do not want to make a scene here. This is not that kind of place." Marcus's fingers tapped lightly once against the table. Not impatient, just deliberate, then stilled again. "Interesting," he said quietly, his voice carrying farther than it should have, because from where I am sitting it already is. A faint ripple moved through the room, subtle but real. Tyler's jaw tightened. He glanced briefly toward the bar where two other staff members were now watching, then back at Marcus. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time," he said, his tone sharpening. "Either you order something right now, or you leave." The ultimatum hung there, simple, direct, and built on the assumption that Marcus needed permission to stay. Marcus looked down at the table for a moment as if considering the offer, then lifted his gaze again, calm as ever. "I will order," he said, and for a split second Tyler looked almost relieved, as if the situation had resolved itself in his favor, until Marcus added, "When I am ready." The words landed softly but carried weight, and something in the way he said them shifted the balance again. Tyler's relief vanished, replaced by irritation. "That is not how this works," he snapped, then quickly corrected his tone, aware of the eyes still on them. "We have a flow here. We have expectations." Marcus leaned forward slightly now, not aggressive, not confrontational, just present, his voice still even. "You keep talking about expectations," he said, "but you have not once asked what I came here for." Tyler blinked, caught off guard for a fraction of a second, then scoffed. "You came here to eat, like everyone else." Marcus's gaze did not waver. "Did I?" he replied, and the question did not sound like a question at all. It sounded like a line being drawn somewhere deeper than the table between them. Across the room, Jamal's grip tightened on the glass he was holding, his pulse picking up, because now he was certain, absolutely certain, and the longer he stayed quiet, the heavier it felt. He glanced toward the manager's office door, then back at Marcus, then at Tyler, who was now visibly losing patience, shifting from one foot to the other, his confidence cracking just enough to show through the edges. "You know what?" Tyler said, stepping back half a pace. "I am getting my manager, because clearly this is not getting through to you." He turned sharply, signaling toward the back, his voice carrying again. "Rachel," he called, and the name alone seemed to tighten the room even further. Conversations dropped another level. Forks settled back onto plates, and Marcus simply leaned back again, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, as if this next step was not escalation but expectation, as if he had already seen it coming long before Tyler ever opened his mouth. Rachel Dunn did not rush when she stepped out from the back office, and that alone changed the rhythm of the room. Her heels striking the polished floor with measured precision, her posture straight, composed, the kind of presence that usually restored order the moment it appeared. But tonight the order had already begun to fracture, and she could feel it before she even reached the table, her eyes scanning the space, catching the tension in the shoulders of her staff, the stillness of the guests, the subtle shift in attention that no manager ever wants to see, because it means the situation is no longer contained. "What seems to be the issue here?" she asked, her voice calm but firm, directing the question toward Tyler without taking her eyes off Marcus. Tyler stepped forward quickly, eager to regain control. "He is refusing to order and will not leave," he said, his tone clipped, confident. "He is holding up the table and disrupting service." Rachel gave a small nod, then turned fully to Marcus, her expression professional, neutral. "Sir, I I'm going to need to understand what is going on, she said. But even as she spoke, there was a slight hesitation in her voice, something subtle, something instinctive, because Marcus did not look like someone lost or confused. He looked like someone waiting. Marcus met her gaze with the same steady calm. I am sitting, he replied simply, the answer so direct it almost felt like a challenge to the question itself. Rachel's brow tightened just slightly. And are you planning to dine with us this evening? She asked, choosing her words carefully. Marcus paused for a moment, not out of uncertainty, but intention, then said, I am planning to observe. The word landed differently than expected. Not defensive, not evasive, just precise, and it caused a faint ripple among the nearest tables. Tyler let out a quiet scoff behind her, unable to hold it back. Observe, he repeated under his breath. But Rachel lifted a hand slightly, signaling him to stop, her attention now fully on Marcus. Sir, this is a restaurant, not a lounge, she said, her tone still controlled, but firmer now. Guests are expected to participate in service. Marcus leaned back slightly again, his expression unchanged. That is what I am doing, he said, and for the first time Rachel's composure flickered, just enough to register that this was not a typical situation. Across the room, Jamal felt his heartbeat in his throat, his eyes darting between Rachel and Marcus, because now he knew she had not checked the system yet. She had not seen what he had seen, and every second that passed made it harder to stay silent. Tyler stepped closer again, sensing an opening. We have standards to maintain, he added, his voice louder now, trying to anchor the narrative before it slipped away, and right now he is not meeting them. Rachel inhaled slowly, weighing the room. The eyes, the pressure building around her, then turned back to Marcus. Sir, I will need to ask you to either place an order or allow us to seat other guests, she said, her tone final. A decision made. But Marcus did not move. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Not hurried, not defensive, just deliberate, and placed it gently on the table in front of him. The motion simple, but loaded. Before I do that, he said quietly, I would like you to confirm something for me. Rachel's gaze dropped briefly to the phone, then back to him. What is that? She asked. Marcus's eyes held hers, steady, unwavering. Pull up the reservation under my name, he said, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath again, because something in the way he said it carried more than a request. It carried certainty. Rachel hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then turned toward the host stand. Can someone check that? She called, her voice controlled but now edged with something else, something closer to concern. Jamal froze, then stepped forward before he could second-guess himself. I can check it, he said, his voice not loud but clear enough to cut through the tension. Tyler shot him a sharp look, but Rachel nodded. Go ahead, she said, and Jamal moved quickly to the terminal, his fingers hovering for a second before typing, the screen lighting up in front of him, the system loading, the seconds stretching longer than they should, and then the name appeared exactly where he had seen it earlier, exactly as he remembered, Marcus Ellington, and beneath it a line that made his breath catch, a line that did not belong to ordinary reservations. He swallowed, his voice tightening as he turned back toward Rachel, toward Tyler, toward the entire room that was now watching him. It is here, he said, and then after a brief pause, as if the weight of the next words mattered more than anything he had ever said in this job, he added, and it is flagged as executive-level clearance. The words did not echo loudly, but they carried farther than any raised voice could have. Executive-level clearance. And for a brief moment, the entire restaurant seemed to lose its rhythm again, the quiet hum of conversation thinning into something sharper, more focused. Rachel's expression did not collapse, but it changed subtly, the kind of shift only visible if you were looking closely. Her shoulders squared a fraction tighter, her eyes narrowing just enough to signal that something no longer aligned with the narrative she had accepted seconds ago. Let me see that, she said, stepping toward the terminal, her tone still controlled but now carrying an edge of urgency. Jamal stepped aside immediately, his hands dropping to his sides as Rachel leaned in, her gaze scanning the screen, the glow reflecting faintly in her eyes. And there was exactly as he had said, the name, the reservation, and beneath it a line she had only seen a handful of times in her career, a a line reserved for individuals who did not need introductions. Her breath paused for half a second before she straightened again, turning slowly back toward Marcus. Tyler noticed the shift instantly, even if he did not understand it yet. "What does that even mean?" he asked, his voice sharper now, pushing against the silence that had begun to work against him. Rachel did not answer him right away, her focus still on Marcus, recalculating, reassessing, the pieces no longer fitting the way they had a moment ago. Marcus remained exactly as he had been, seated, composed, his phone still resting untouched on the table, his presence unchanged by the revelation. And that was what made it heavier, because nothing about him needed to adjust. He had not been guessing, he had been certain. Tyler let out a small, incredulous laugh, trying to pull the situation back into something familiar. "So what?" "He knows someone," he said, gesturing loosely toward Marcus. "That does not mean he gets to just sit here and—" "Tyler," Rachel cut in, her voice low but firm, and the interruption alone was enough to stop a mid-sentence. She rarely used that tone on the floor, not in front of guests. And the fact that she did now was not lost on anyone watching. She took a step closer to the table, her posture no longer confrontational, but careful, deliberate. "Sir," she began, addressing Marcus again, "can you clarify your purpose here tonight?" The question sounded similar to before, but the weight behind it had shifted. It was no longer about removing him. It was about understanding what she might already be too late to control. Marcus looked up at her, calm as ever. "I already did," he said quietly. "I came to observe." A man at a nearby table leaned back slightly, whispering something to his partner. The tension in the room no longer uncomfortable, but anticipatory, like the moment before something irreversible. Tyler shifted again, his confidence eroding now. "This is getting ridiculous," he muttered, louder than he intended. "We are running a restaurant, not enough," Rachel said, not raising her voice, but ending the sentence before it could finish. She did not look at him this time, her attention fixed entirely on Marcus, because now the risk was no longer just about one guest. It was about everything that had already been said, everything that had already been witnessed. Jamal stood near the terminal, his heart still racing, watching the shift happen in real time. The same room, the same people, but the power moving quietly from one side to another. Marcus's gaze moved briefly across the room again, acknowledging the eyes, the silence, the awareness that had settled over the space. Then back to Rachel. "You said this place has standards," he said, his voice even. "I wanted to see if that was true." The words landed heavier than before, because now they were no longer abstract. They were anchored to everything that had already happened. Rachel inhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling in, because she understood something now that Tyler did not. This was no longer a situation she could resolve with a simple decision. It was something that had already been set in motion, something that would not be undone by asking him to leave or offering him a menu. Tyler looked between them, frustration rising, confusion tightening his voice. "Can someone just explain what is going on?" he said, and for the first time there was no confidence in it, only uncertainty. Marcus finally reached for his phone, not quickly, not dramatically, just with the same deliberate calm that had defined every movement since he sat down, his fingers resting lightly against the screen before he looked back at Rachel. "You might want to call your regional office," he said, and the sentence was not a suggestion. It was a line drawn quietly across the room, one that everyone felt even if they did not yet understand it. Rachel's eyes held his for a moment longer, and in that silence, she realized something that shifted everything. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a test, and they had already given their answers. For a moment, no one moved. Not Rachel, not Tyler, not even the guests who had been quietly watching as the tension thickened into something heavier than discomfort. Because the words had changed the shape of the room. "Call your regional office." It was not a request. It was not even a warning. It was a confirmation that whatever authority they thought they had was already being measured against something far above it. Rachel felt it settle in her chest, that quiet realization that this was no longer about managing a difficult guest, but about understanding how far this situation had already gone. And behind that realization came something else, something sharper, The memory of policies, of training modules, of scenarios that were never supposed to happen, but always had instructions for what to do if they did. And none of those instructions began with raising your voice or questioning a guest presence. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself, but before she could respond, Tyler stepped forward again, unable to accept the shift that was happening right in front of him. "This is not how this works," he said, his voice tighter now, the confidence replaced by frustration. You do not just walk in here and start making demands like that." Marcus did not respond immediately, his gaze drifting for a brief second past Tyler, past Rachel, toward the far wall where a framed photograph hung. A black and white image of a much smaller restaurant, the original location, the one that started it all. And for the first time, something in his expression shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could name, but internally, a memory surfacing with quiet clarity. He was 19, standing outside a diner on the south side of the city, the neon sign flickering above him, the smell of fried food drifting through the open door. He had stepped inside with two friends after a long shift, still in his work clothes, tired but hopeful, and the man behind the counter had looked at him once, then again, and said the same words in a different tone. "You do not belong here." No explanation, no apology, just a decision made in seconds that followed him for years. He remembered the silence that followed, the way no one in the room had said anything, the way he had turned and walked back out into the cold night air, telling himself it did not matter, telling himself he would build something different one day, something better. And now, standing in a restaurant that carried his vision, his standards, his name in ways most people in the room would never fully understand, he heard those same words echo again, softer, more polished, but unchanged at their core. And when he brought his focus back to the present, his voice carried that weight, calm but unyielding. "I am not making demands," he said, looking directly at Tyler now. "I'm asking you to look at what you have already done." The sentence did not rise in volume, but it landed harder than anything that had been said so far. Tyler opened his mouth to respond, then paused, because for the first time he did not have a quick answer, not one that sounded right in a room that had turned into witnesses instead of customers. Rachel felt it too, the shift from confrontation to consequence, the point where words stopped being about control and started being about accountability. She reached for the small tablet tucked under her arm, her fingers hovering over the screen as if she needed something concrete to hold on to, something procedural, something that still made sense. "I will contact regional," she said finally, her voice measured, and even that admission changed the air again, because it acknowledged something no one had said out loud yet, that this situation was no longer contained within these walls. Jamal let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, watching as the pieces aligned in a way that confirmed what he had suspected from the moment he saw the reservation. Tyler stepped back half a pace, his expression tightening, the certainty that had carried him earlier now replaced by something closer to doubt. "This is being blown out of proportion," he muttered, but the words lacked the strength they once had. Marcus did not look at him again, his attention shifting back to Rachel. "Take your time," he said quietly. "But understand something," he added, and there was no anger in it, only clarity. This was never about a table. Rachel's hand stilled on the tablet because she understood exactly what he meant. This was about every word, every assumption, every decision made in those first moments when no one thought it would matter, and now it did. Now all of it did, and there was no way to undo it, only a way to respond to it, and that difference was about to define everything that came next. The moment Rachel said she would contact regional, the invisible line that had been forming all night finally became real, not drawn in ink or policy, but in consequence. And Marcus did not rush it. He did not lean forward or press for action. He simply reached for his phone again, and this time he unlocked it, the screen lighting softly against the table as his fingers moved with quiet precision. Not hurried, not uncertain, but practiced, the kind of movement that came from someone who had done this before, someone who understood that power did not need to be loud to be absolute. Rachel stepped a few feet away as she dialed, her voice low as she spoke into the receiver, controlled but unmistakably tense. The words corporate escalation and verification slipping through in fragments that carried more weight than their volume suggested. Tyler stood where he was, arms now folded tightly across his chest, as if trying to hold onto something that was already slipping, his eyes flicking between Rachel and Marcus, searching for a version of this situation that still made sense to him. But the longer he looked, the less familiar it became. Across the room, the guest had stopped pretending not to watch. The quiet observation had turned into open attention. Phones were not raised, but eyes were, and that alone shifted the balance of the room, because now this was not just a moment. It was a record, a memory that would not disappear when the night ended. Marcus glanced down at his phone again, his thumb tapping once, then pausing. And when he spoke, his voice was as steady as it had been from the beginning. "Caroline," he said, and though no one on the other end could be heard, the response was immediate, efficient, the kind of silence that carried confirmation. "Yes, I am at the downtown Chicago location," he continued, not raising his voice, not needing to. "I need you to initiate a full-service audit on this branch, effective now." A few heads turned more sharply at that, the word audit landing like a quiet alarm. Tyler's posture shifted again, his confidence now replaced by something closer to unease. Marcus listened for a moment, then added, "Include staff interaction logs and incident reports for the last 6 months. Flag anything related to guest removal or service denial." He paused again, his gaze lifting briefly toward Rachel, who was still on her call, but now watching him, her expression no longer guarded but alert. "Yes," Marcus said into the phone. "And keep the line open." He ended the call with the same calm precision and set the phone back down exactly where it had been, as if nothing about the action required emphasis. But the room felt it anyway, the shift from tension to inevitability. Rachel ended her call a second later, lowering the receiver slowly, her face composed, but no longer certain. She stepped back toward the table, her voice quieter now, measured, in a way it had not been before. "I have someone reviewing the reservation and the clearance status," she said, and even that phrasing carried a subtle change. It was no longer about whether Marcus belonged there. It was about understanding what his presence meant. Tyler let out a short breath, shaking his head. "This is insane," he muttered, though the words lacked conviction. "We are acting like he runs the place." The sentence hung in the air longer than he intended, and for a moment no one responded. Not Rachel, not Marcus, not even the guests who had been following every shift in tone and posture, because something about it felt closer to the truth than Tyler realized. Marcus's eyes met his again, calm, unwavering. And there was no need to correct him, no need to argue or explain, because the answer was already moving through the system Rachel had just contacted, already reaching people who would recognize the name without hesitation. Jamal stood near the terminal, his hands now still at his sides, watching everything unfold with a clarity that made his earlier hesitation feel distant. He had seen the name, he had said the words, but now he was watching what they meant. Rachel took a slow breath, her gaze shifting between Marcus and Tyler, then back again, weighing not just the situation but the outcome that was already beginning to form. "We need to wait for confirmation," she said finally, but even as she spoke it sounded less like a plan and more like a delay. Because deep down she already understood what that confirmation would bring. Marcus leaned back once more, his posture unchanged, his presence as steady as ever. And when he spoke again, it was not louder, not sharper, just final in a way that settled into the room without resistance. "You have already been given it," he said quietly, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was expectant because everyone in that room could feel it now. The shift had already happened. They were just waiting for it to be spoken out loud. The silence stretched just long enough to become undeniable, not empty but full, heavy with everything that had already been said and everything that was about to be confirmed. And then it happened, not with a shout or a dramatic interruption, but with something far quieter. Rachel's phone vibrated in her hand, a small sound that somehow carried across the entire dining room. Her eyes dropped to the screen, and in that single glance the last piece fell into place. Her posture changed again, not slightly this time, but completely, the kind of shift that no one needed explained. She straightened, her shoulders pulling back, her expression tightening into something no longer uncertain but resolved. And when she looked up at Marcus, it was not with doubt, not even with caution, but with recognition. Tyler saw it instantly, and something in his chest tightened before a single word was spoken. "What is it?" he asked, his voice lower now, the edge gone, replaced by something closer to concern. Rachel did not answer him right away, because the answer was not something you rushed. It was something you delivered carefully, especially when the entire room was already leaning into the moment. She stepped closer to the table, her gaze steady on Marcus, and then she said it, not loudly, not for effect, but clearly enough that no one could miss it. "Sir, I have just received confirmation." She paused just a fraction, the weight of the next words settling in. "You are listed as principal, owner of this location and the parent restaurant group." The sentence landed like a quiet detonation. No explosion, no chaos, just a complete and total shift in everything that had existed seconds before. Tyler blinked, once, then again, as if his mind needed time to catch up with what his ears had just heard. "That is not possible," he said quickly, too quickly. The denial automatic, instinctive, but lacked the force it needed to hold, because the room had already accepted the truth before he did. A man near the bar let out a low whistle under his breath. A woman at the window covered her mouth slightly, not in shock, but in realization. Jamal stood completely still now, the weight of what he had recognized earlier settling into something real, something undeniable. Marcus did not react the way anyone might have expected. He did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He did not look around for validation. He simply remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the table, his gaze calm as it moved from Rachel to Tyler. And when he spoke, his voice carried no anger, no triumph, just clarity. "You told me I did not belong here," he said, each word measured, precise, in a place I built. The sentence did not need emphasis. It did not need repetition. It landed exactly as it was, and the silence that followed was different from before, not tense, not uncertain, but final. Tyler's mouth opened slightly, then closed again, his posture shifting as if he no longer knew where to stand, his earlier confidence now completely gone, replaced by something he could not mask. Rachel lowered her gaze for a brief moment, not out of submission but acknowledgement, because she understood the weight of what had just been revealed, not just the title, not just the ownership, but everything that had happened before it, every word, every assumption, every decision made without knowledge, but not without consequence. "Sir," she began, her tone now entirely different, respectful, careful. "I apologize for how this situation was handled." Marcus looked at her, steady, unblinking, and for a moment it seemed like the room itself leaned closer to hear what would come next, because this was the point where everything could shift again, not in power but in meaning. Tyler shook his head slightly, almost to himself. "No," he muttered, barely audible. "There is no way," but even he could hear how empty it sounded, because the truth was no longer something he could argue against. It was something standing right in front of him, calm, composed, undeniable. And for the first time since the night began, Marcus leaned forward just slightly, not aggressively, not to intimidate, but to close the distance between words and understanding. "The problem was never that you did not know who I was," he said quietly, his voice carrying through the room without effort. "The problem is how you treated someone you thought did not matter." And that sentence did not just land on Tyler. It moved through the entire space, through every table, every guest, every staff member who had watched and listened and now understood exactly what they had witnessed. Not just a mistake, not just a misunderstanding, but a moment that revealed something deeper, something harder to ignore. And in that moment, the restaurant was no longer just a place for dinner. It was something else entirely, a reflection of choices made in seconds that would now carry far beyond this night. No one spoke immediately after the words settled, because there was nothing left to interrupt them, no confusion to hide behind, no authority left to lean on, just a quiet weight of truth sitting in the middle of the room. It began to move outward slowly, not through sound but through reaction. Rachel straightened fully now, her posture no longer uncertain but decisive. The kind of clarity that comes when hesitation is no longer an option. She turned slightly toward Tyler. Not sharply, not aggressively, but with a firmness that made it clear the balance had shifted completely. "Tyler," she said, her voice low but carrying across the space, "step away from the table." It was not a suggestion, not phrased as one. And the difference was immediate. Tyler hesitated, just a fraction of a second, as if waiting for the version of reality he understood to return, but it did not. And in that silence he realized there was nothing left to hold onto, no argument, no justification that could survive what had just been revealed. He took a small step back, then another, his movements slower now, uncertain, as if each step required him to accept something he had not been prepared to face. The guests watched without speaking, their attention no longer curious, but focused, because now they were not just witnessing a moment, they were witnessing the outcome. Rachel turned back to Marcus, her tone measured, professional, but now carrying a level of respect that had not been there before. "We are initiating immediate internal review," she said, each word deliberate, "and all staff interactions from tonight are being documented and submitted." Marcus nodded once, not approving, not dismissing, simply acknowledging, as if this was not a surprise, but an expected step in a process already in motion. Jamal stood near the terminal, his chest rising and falling a little slower now, watching as the room reorganized itself around the truth, his earlier hesitation replaced by a quiet sense of clarity. Because for the first time since the night began, the direction of things felt aligned with something real. Rachel reached for her tablet again, her fingers moving quickly now, no longer hovering, no longer unsure. Names were being logged, timestamps recorded, actions noted, not for show, not for appearance, but for consequence. And everyone in the room could feel it, the shift from conversation to accountability. Tyler stood a few feet away now, his arms no longer crossed, his posture no longer rigid. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in presence, as if the authority he had been wearing earlier had been removed without warning. "I did not know," he said quietly, the words almost to himself, but they carried just enough to reach the table. Marcus's gaze moved toward him again, calm, steady, and there was no anger in it, only clarity. "That is the point," he said, and the simplicity of the response made it heavier, because it did not argue, it did not accuse, it simply revealed. Rachel paused in her typing for a moment, her eyes lifting as she took in the full scope of what had unfolded, the guests, the staff, the silence that had now turned into something else entirely. Something resolved. She turned back to Marcus. "There will be immediate corrective action," she said, her voice firm, "effective tonight," and the words were not performative, they were procedural, grounded in a system that now had no choice but to respond. Marcus leaned back once more, his posture returning to the same calm position he had held from the beginning, his presence unchanged by the shift around him. Because for him, this was not escalation, it was confirmation, the process working exactly as it should. "Make sure it is not just tonight," he said quietly, and the sentence landed with a different kind of weight, one that reached beyond the room, beyond the moment, into something larger, something systemic. Rachel nodded once, understanding immediately, because this was not about a single interaction, not about one employee or one decision. It was about a pattern, a standard, something that either existed or did not. And tonight had revealed the answer. The guests began to move again, slowly at first, conversations returning in low tones, but different now, shaped by what they had just seen. A man near the bar shook his head slightly, not in disbelief, but in recognition. A woman at the window leaned toward her partner, whispering something that carried a tone of respect rather than shock. Jamal stepped back from the terminal, his role in the moment complete, but not forgotten, and for a brief second Marcus's gaze met his, a quiet acknowledgement that needed no words. Tyler remained where he was, still, silent, the weight of everything settling in around him. And for the first time he understood that this was never about a table, never about a seat or a section or a policy. It was about something far more fundamental, something he had overlooked in seconds and would now have to face in full. And as the room settled into its new rhythm, one thing was clear to everyone who had witnessed it. The shift had not been loud. It had not been dramatic, but it had been absolute, and there was no going back to what it had been before. The restaurant did not return to what it had been before. Not really. Even as the soft music resumed its place in the background and servers moved between tables again, there was a difference now, something quieter but deeper, a shift in awareness that lingered in the air like the final note of a song that refuses to fade. Marcus remained seated for a moment longer, not because he needed to, but because he understood something the others were only beginning to grasp, that moments like this were not about the reaction. They were about the reflection that followed. Rachel stood a few steps away, her tablet now lowered at her side. The urgency of action replaced by the weight of understanding. She looked at Marcus not as a guest, not even as an owner, but as someone who had just held a mirror up to everything she thought she managed. And in that reflection, she saw not just one mistake, but the possibility of many. "We will correct this," she said finally, her voice steady but quieter than before. And Marcus nodded once, not as approval but acknowledgement, because correction was not a promise. It was a process. Tyler had not moved much, his position unchanged, but his presence entirely different. The certainty that once defined him gone, replaced by something more difficult to carry, awareness. He looked at Marcus again, not with defiance, not even with confusion, but with a kind of realization that arrives too late to stop what has already happened. "I thought I was doing my job," he said, his voice low, almost uncertain, and Marcus held his gaze for a moment before responding, not sharply, not dismissively, but with a calm that made the words land heavier. "Your job is not just service," he said. "It is judgment, and tonight you showed exactly how you use it." Tyler lowered his eyes, not out of shame alone, but because the truth in that sentence did not leave room for anything else. Around them, the guests had begun to settle back into their meals. But the tone had changed. Conversations carried a different kind of energy now, quieter, more thoughtful, as if everyone present had taken something from what they had seen. A man near the bar raised his glass slightly in Marcus's direction, not drawing attention, just a small gesture of recognition, and Marcus acknowledged it with the slightest nod. Nothing more, because this was never about applause. Jamal stepped forward again, hesitating for only a second before speaking. "Sir," he said, his voice steady despite the moment, "would you like me to bring you a menu?" And there was something different in the way he asked, not just respect, but intention. Marcus looked at him, really looked this time, and a faint expression crossed his face, not quite a smile, but something close. "Yes," he said simply, and Jamal nodded, turning quickly, but not nervously, moving with a sense of purpose that had not been there earlier. Rachel watched that exchange carefully, because it represented something she could not ignore, the difference between assumption and awareness, between reaction and understanding. Marcus reached for his glass again, taking another slow sip, the same deliberate motion that had marked the beginning of the night. But now it meant something else entirely. Not patience, but completion. The test had already been given, the results already revealed, and the response already set in motion. He set the glass down and looked out toward the windows, the city lights still stretching beyond the glass, unchanged by anything that had happened inside. And when he spoke again, it was not directed at any one person, but carried clearly enough for those closest to hear. "I did not come here to be recognized," he said, his voice even, reflective. "I came here to see if recognition was required for respect." The sentence settled into the room with a quiet finality, and no one interrupted it, because there was nothing to argue, nothing to correct, only something to carry forward. Rachel nodded once more, understanding the statement for what it was. Not just a conclusion, but a standard, one that would outlast the moment itself. Tyler remained still, absorbing it in a way that would likely stay with him far longer than this night. Jamal returned with the menu and placed it gently in front of Marcus, this time without hesitation, without assumption, just service, exactly as it should have been from the start. And Marcus opened it slowly, not because he needed to, but because it marked the final shift, not in power, but in principle. The room continued around him, the rhythm restored but not unchanged, and as the night moved forward, one truth remained clear to everyone who had witnessed it. He had never raised his voice, never demanded respect. He had simply revealed the standard, and in doing so he changed the way it would be measured long after he left.